All right, welcome back, class, to our second session with Hobbes. Today, we're principally going to focus on the second book of the Leviathan. I'll briefly recap the argument in the first part, which is about the state of nature and man in his natural condition. And from there, Hobbes will powerfully drive through the argument for why there's a need for the absolute sovereign authority. So, to recall the argument from book one, human beings by nature are simply naturalistic entities, naturalistic creatures who have certain dispositions, certain appetites, in pursuit of which they have, as Hobbes puts it, the right to everything, right? This is again from chapter 14. He says, it followed that in such a condition, that is the condition of man in the state of nature, every man has a right to everything, even to one another's body, right? So whatever it is that you want for yourself, and whatever that is that you want to avoid, you are right to do. And everything, there can be no moral assessment, judgment. There's no conception of justice in such a situation. So the argument follows from this, however, that despite the fact that we are endowed to have a right of nature, that is the right to, that we are free to do whatever we want in order to satisfy our appetites, we still nonetheless are constrained by a certain conception of the law of nature, right? And he says, again, I'm quoting, that every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it, and when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek to use all helps and advantages of war. So if there's a possibility to achieve peace, then reason dictates us. This is the law of nature. Reason dictates us that for self-preservation, we should try to attain that orderly, peaceful settlement. So from this, he derives the second law, which again comes in chapter 14. He says that the man be willing when others are so too. Notice the conditionality of this clause. He says that a man be willing when others are so too. So it involves mutuality and reciprocity. It cannot just be one person, right? It has to involve a certain kind of reciprocal commitment by others as well, others who are part of this multitude that inhabits the state of nature. As for peace and defense of himself, he shall think it necessary to lay down his right to all things. So the second law of nature, which is derived from the first, says that if there is a possibility to come to some kind of mutual reciprocal agreement, then we might collectively all agree to lay down our freedom, lay down our liberty and our right of nature, which is to do whatever we like, right? Unlimited and unrestrained freedom to do whatever we want. So this raises the question now, what exactly would be the nature of this agreement? Here, Hobbes discusses this concept, the concept of the social contract or the social covenant. In doing this, he institutes a whole tradition of political thinking, which is called the social contract tradition. Namely, and the basic, the depth and the basic thrust of this insight is in some sense that all forms of political authority require some form of consent from below. That is, real political authority, power, emerges from below. That no matter what kind of political institution and structure you have, no matter how repressive, no matter how violent, no matter how tyrannical, nonetheless relies on a certain level of consent. Relies of a certain level of consent, that is, people agree to accept those circumstances, right? So we'll see why this is such a powerful insight. Hobbes has now said that if you want to emerge, reason dictates us that if there's a possibility to pursue a path of peace, to escape the state of nature, then we should follow it. And that is conditional on our ability to trust one another. That is, I promise that I will not kill you as long as you promise not to kill me. So the only reason why I would accept this kind of agreement is if there is somebody to guarantee that peace, if there is somebody who can back and make sure that the promises on both sides are kept, right? So how does this happen? First, let us dive a little bit in detail into this very notion of what it means to lay down your right? That is to renounce or sacrifice your right. Now he says, right is laid aside. This is again from chapter 14, either by simply renouncing it or by transferring it to another. By simply renouncing, when he cares not to whom the benefit thereof redoundeth, that is, simply doesn't care who gets the benefit of it. In a way, renouncing your right to life, renouncing your liberty in the state of nature is, in some sense, to accept a fatality. But by transferring, when he intended the benefit thereof to some certain person or persons. So you transfer your right. It is a certain kind of rational transaction where you are transferring your right to somebody else. Okay. Now, who you're transferring your right to has to be someone who can guarantee peace. So the whole argument is that people, the multitude, the vast multitude living in the state of nature, come together and agree to collectively and mutually renounce or transfer their right to each other's lives and unlimited right to their life and preservation of life to some higher authority, who can guarantee peace. This is crucial. Let's move on to towards the middle of chapter 14, where he says, again, this is the notion of the covenant. It's an absolutely crucial argument. This mutual, he firstly says, the mutual transferring of right is that which we call contract. Okay, and then under what conditions would a contract be useful in guaranteeing peace? He says, if a covenant be made wherein neither of the parties perform presently, but trust one another in the condition of mere nature, which is a condition of war of every man against every man, upon any reasonable suspicion, it is void, right? So if you're simply making an agreement with each other and there's really nothing to back that up, then you're back to a state of nature. There is no real agreement. The covenant is void. But so now it becomes important to understand why transferring of right, transferring of your liberty is an important move in the argument. He says, but if there be a common power set over them both, with right and force sufficient to compel performance. Performance means obedience to that contract, obedience to that covenant. It is not void. So in order to make sure that people obey the agreement they come to, it is necessary for there to be some kind of common power above them that can enforce that agreement, that contract. For he that performed first has no assurance that the other will perform after, because the bonds of words are too weak to bridle men's ambition, avarice, anger, and other passions. So the commitment by word, me simply saying that, yeah, I promise not to kill you, is not sufficient, without the fear of some coercive power, which in the condition of mere nature, where all men are equal, the judges of justness of their own fears cannot possibly supposed to do. So if I'm in a condition of nature, in the state of nature, and I'm the judge of my own actions, I'm the measure of all things, then there's absolutely no reason for me to trust anybody else. However, if there is a coercive power above me and the person with whom I'm agreeing to go into contract with, then I would be compelled to obey, because I would fear that greater power. So the whole argument now, this is where the form of the Commonwealth comes into appearance. This is how society is instituted for Hobbes. Society and social order emerges when people come together to make a social covenant, a pact with each other, to agree to escape the state of nature. And it's a mutual relationship of protection and obedience. They transfer their rights. So every individual has the right to the unlimited right to do anything they want in order to preserve their life, and they voluntarily relinquish and transfer that right to a greater power above them. Greater power above them, to whom they obey. Right? whom they are willing to obey, because that will guarantee peace and that will guarantee compromise. So social compact is this kind of promise, which is internal to ourselves. It is a kind of mental procedure. We don't really need to sign a contract. I presume that since you've been born and to your life now, you have never really signed a contract with anyone saying that you will never murder anyone, nor has anybody else signed a contract which says they will not murder you, right? But it's a kind of mental procedure that you go through, in some sense, that I'm willing to obey the laws. I'm willing to not exercise my right of nature because I have relinquished that right, and I've transferred it to some higher power, some higher common power, coercive power, that can enforce the social covenant I'm a part of, which will guarantee my peace and security. So it works only with reciprocity. Okay. Now, what is the end result of this? The end result of this is precisely the establishment of a sovereign, of a commonwealth or a state. Let's now move to book 2, the first chapter. He says, the final cause, this is the first passage, the final cause, end, or design of men who naturally love liberty and dominion over others in the introduction of that restraint upon themselves. Right? Restraint upon themselves. That is, we are, again, not exercising our right to everything. We are restraining ourselves, limiting our appetites, or we are limiting our desires to pursue our appetites. Right? So it's a limitation, self-imposed limitation, is the foresight of their own preservation. So it follows from the law of nature, because it's found out by reason, we're able to predict what can be the outcome of this kind of agreement. So our foresight predisposes us to arrive at this kind of social covenant, and of a more contented life thereby. That is to say, of getting themselves out of that miserable condition of war, which is necessarily consequent to the natural passions of men, when there is no visible power to keep them in awe. So the sovereign, the state, is something who has so much power that they can keep us in awe so that we no longer act violently towards others. We uphold our promise to limit ourselves, to restrain ourselves, right? So transferring our right to create something that is so powerful that we are in awe of it, right? And tie them by fear of punishment. Fear of punishment. That is, this is what compels us to obey. If we violate our terms of agreement, if we violate the contract on our behalf, then we will be punished. So although nobody has ever signed a contract that they will not murder you, and you have not signed a contract that you will not murder anyone, nonetheless, you know that people in our societies murder each other. Murder is a crime. But they get punished for it. Why do they get punished for it? It's because the sovereign, the state, must exercise its coercive power in order to enforce the agreement, because they have violated that agreement. Right? They have violated that agreement, and they must be punished. They have taken, in other words, the law in their own hands. They have managed to contest, in some sense, the authority of the sovereign, because they have tried to exercise their right, which they should have transferred to the sovereign. Right? That's the argument. Now, one of the serious implications of this, serious implication of the fact that all individuals who are part of this multitude who inhabit the state of nature give up all right to govern ourselves for our own self-preservation, we give our consent to obey conditionally for peace. So it's a mutual relation between protection and obedience. Now, the important thing is that this social covenant is only between us, the people. Right? It is actually the sovereign is not party to this covenant. The sovereign guarantees the covenant, but he's necessarily above and outside of this covenant. This, again, is a very serious implication of the nature of the argument Hobbes is making. If a sovereign becomes party to the covenant, that is, he becomes a member who's part of the social contract, then it necessarily means there has to be somebody else who will enforce the part of the sovereign's commitment to that agreement. Right? So it necessarily implies that there is some higher power even over the sovereign, and that cannot be. The sovereign has to be the absolute and highest authority. Okay, so to read the argument again from chapter 17. This is a very long passage, the last two passages of these, but these are absolutely crucial. So it might be worthwhile to read all of them. The only way to erect such a common power, the only way, as may be able to defend them from the invasion of foreigners and the injuries of one another, and thereby to secure them in such sort, as that by their own industry and by fruits of earth they may nourish themselves and live contently, is to confer all their power and strength upon one man or upon an assembly of men, that may reduce their wills by plurality of voices onto one will. This is again a very serious argument, in that it's making a claim about what it means for there to be a unity amongst a people mediated through a social covenant. Right? So before we enter into a social covenant, into a contract with each other, we are simply a vast multitude of separate individuals pursuing our own plurality of interests, desires, and appetites. We have no obligations to anybody. We have no predisposition to obey any rules. However, in order to aspire for peace, again, worked out by the law of nature, found out by reason, if we all agree to transfer our rights onto this higher common power that can guarantee peace, then what we are doing, in fact, is that we are establishing a certain kind of unity. A unity, we are coming together as a people. So he says, by plurality of voices onto one will, which is as much as to say, to appoint one man or assembly of men to bear their person. Bear their person. So the sovereign is an artificial person, an artificial creation, right? And everyone to own and acknowledge himself to be the author of whatsoever he that so beareth the person shall act or cause to be acted in those things which concern the common peace and safety, and therein to submit their wills, every one of his will, and to every one of his will, and their judgments to his judgment. This is more than consent or concord. It is real unity of them all in one and the same person, made by the covenant of every man with every man in such a manner as if every man should say to every man, I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or to this assembly of men, on this condition that thou give up thy right to him and authorize all his action in like manner. This done, the multitude so united in one person is called a commonwealth. So the multitude becomes one. A multitude becomes a people, a nation, a state, only through the social covenant that establishes sovereign power, right? That establishes absolute sovereign power that is that has no obligations or limitations on itself, right? So this multitude so united in one person is the commonwealth. This is the generation of that great Leviathan, or rather of that mortal God, to which we owe under the immortal God our peace and defense. So the Leviathan, the state, the person of the state, this artificial man that is created through this social covenant, is something to which we depend on for our peace and defense. And it is the obligation of the sovereign to guarantee peace and to defend us from both foreign invasions, but also internal rife and discord. So he says, continues, for by this authority, given him by every particular man in the commonwealth, he had the use of so much power and strength conferred on him. So the power, again, notice that this argument about the consent and unity of the people is essential, because the power of the commonwealth comes from precisely all these particular men uniting through the social covenant, right? So the whole unity, the unity co-constitutes both the people as an entity, as opposed to a vast multitude of different people. So it unites them into having one will. So let's say we are one nation and we all want something, right? We all believe in this nation. So we acquire a sense of peoplehood, a sense of unity, but that occurs again, it is co-constituted in the sense that it happens together and it's mutually dependent on each other, especially when we also conceive of the sovereign authority over us, right? Over us, that will guarantee peace and safety to us. So he says, for by this authority given him by every particular man in commonwealth, he had the use of so much power and strength conferred on him that by terror thereof he is enabled to fortune the wills of them all, to peace at home and mutual aid against their enemies abroad. And in him consists the essence of the commonwealth, which, in one person, of those acts of a great multitude, by mutual covenants, one with another, have made themselves every one the author. So we are all the authors of the sovereign. We are all collectively the artists behind this art creation of this artificial man. To the end he may use the strength and means of them all, as he shall think expedient for the peace and common defense. And he that carrieth this person is called sovereign, and said to have the sovereign power, and everyone besides him his subject. So in relation to the sovereign, again, what is important to note is that the sovereign, we'll see again the argument, is not one person. It's not a monarch. It's not the body of one individual. The sovereign is, in some sense, an artificial office which anyone can hold, right? It can be a monarch, it can be an assembly, it can be a parliament. But the point is that this body, this artificial body, has a unity, right? And that's why it has a face. It has a certain kind of unified conception of will, and its purpose is to make sure that everybody who has authorized, it's an argument of authorization. We have transferred our right and we have authorized somebody else to have power over us in order to make sure that we are no longer in the state of nature and we can avoid the violence and bloodshed of that state of nature. So the attaining to this sovereign power is by two ways. One, by natural force, as when man maketh his children to submit themselves and their children to his government, as being able to destroy them if they refuse, or by war, subdued by his enemies to his will, given them their lives on this condition. The other is when men agree among themselves to submit to some man or assembly of men, voluntarily on confidence to be protected by him against all others. This latter we may call the political commonwealth or commonwealth by institution, as opposed to the former, which is by conquest, right? Somebody else conquers you, and you nonetheless submit to their rule because they might be able to guarantee you peace, right? This again raises difficult questions about the difference between institution and acquisition. Right? So if somebody comes and conquers your nation and you submit to their rule, it simply means, again, in the Hobbesian worldview, that you are entering into a certain kind of social compact with the multitude around you, and you're accepting to transfer your rights onto this new sovereign, this foreign conqueror, precisely on the condition that they're going to guarantee peace. Because otherwise, the bad outcome you face is the anarchy of the state of nature. Now, one of the major implications of this, and it's a question, well, what is the right of the sovereign? And as we've seen already, in some sense, the sovereign has now the right to everything. The sovereign has no limitations, because otherwise it would mean that there's somebody else contesting absolute sovereignty. And if there's other competition and contestation for sovereign power, it means precisely that there's no one singular guarantor for the social covenant, and it will dissolve and disunite the people. The people cannot exist. The people as a unified entity cannot exist without one unified sovereign. Why? Because again, the people cannot exist before the sovereign, because there's no consensus possible in the state of nature. This whole argument about consensus is an impossibility. It has to be backed by force. It has to be backed and guaranteed by coercive power. Only then can there be any kind of harmony in society and peace in society. So the sole objective of the sovereign is to guarantee this kind of protection and protection to its citizens, and guaranteeing the covenant itself. Right? So the sovereign power is absolute. The sovereign power, the office of the sovereign has no obligation to anybody because they are not a party to the covenant. They enjoy the right to all things. And your rights are what the sovereign gives you. It's akin to the phrase from the Bible, the Lord giveth and taketh away, the sovereign giveth and taketh away. Your rights and your liberties are that which the sovereign gives you. Okay. And then the question is, well, should there be limitations? Should there be checks and balances? In the conclusion, Hobbes says that in this book, his attempt has been to argue against both unlimited authority and unlimited liberty, right? To chart a middle course between these. And the argument for unlimited authority in his time was the argument made about divine right of kings, that it somehow, from religious scripture, you can derive an argument for the justification of monarchs. And on the other hand was the parliamentary argument about limitations on the authority of the monarch, that there should be some kind of body parliament that can check and balance the power. So this whole notion of checks and balances, which comes out of a kind of Republican conception of politics, as we saw with Machiavelli, and Hobbes wants to contest that absolutely, right? And the argument precisely boils down to the fact that, well, if you're going to have checks and balances, if you're going to have a counter institution that checks the power of the sovereign, and there's a dispute between those two, who decides? Who decides? Because if there's a third body that decides between the dispute, then that implies that the third body has greater power, greater coercive power over the other two, because they can guarantee any kind of contract or agreement or consensus between the two, right? Any resolution of dispute between the sovereign and some other institution that checks their power must be guaranteed by a third power, which cannot be, right? Which would simply mean that there is a third sovereign superpower over the other two, right? So in order for there to be a unified absolute sovereign, there cannot be any checks and balances. This is his whole attack on this argument about liberty, right? His point is that when you talk about liberty, what you're really talking about is the liberty of the Commonwealth itself, of the state itself. You're not talking about liberty of individuals within the state. The individuals within the state have necessarily relinquished that. They have transferred those rights, their liberties, their natural liberties, onto the state. And the state now has the right to everything. So the freedom of the state to do anything it pleases in order to make sure that the lives of the citizens are protected is what matters. But this is a conditional arrangement, right? You only abide by it because it will guarantee you peace. But the whole point is that there cannot be any disunity. There cannot be any contestation about the sovereign power. The office of the sovereign is not subject to any kind of contestation. Nobody can come and split it up because human beings in the state of nature simply cannot arrive at any kind of consensus. This is the implication of this also. This is not an argument that we're going to read in detail because this comes mostly in the third book, but it is about religion and religious scripture. And Hobbes' point is that, well, if you look at the religious scriptures, there's absolutely no one singular dominant interpretation, that you can have multiple interpretations. And more than that, the grounds on which one claims to be the dominant interpretation are also flimsy, right? So consensus is impossible when it comes to religious interpretations. Who do you decide? Are the Protestants more convincing or the Catholics? And his point is that it has to be the sovereign that decides. The sovereign that decides. Now, religion can play an important social function for Hobbes, which is that it makes men obedient, and obedience is important because the greater you have obedience, because the existence of the sovereign, the stability of the sovereign requires obedience from the subjects. So religion, in that sense, again, similar to Machiavelli, has a social role to play. It has a function to play, but the concern with what is really the divine truth of the scripture is not something that can be decided upon. So it is the sovereign. It is the sovereign that decides. The sovereign decides what the church, the institution of the church will say, what the doctrinal truth of the church is. Again, a kind of bizarre argument, but if you see through it, you will notice that this is in fact the birth of secularism in some sense, because the argument is that matters of religion have to be decided by some kind of secular political authority that is superior to the church. So the So this is a relentless, the argument is a relentless subordination of the church to the state. The church cannot decide, right? It is the sovereign that will get to decide. And the issue becomes more powerful or more potent if you understand that the argument is not that the sovereign knows scripture better than anybody else. It is not because of expertise. It is not because of some kind of divine revelation that God has in fact called the sovereign and explained to the sovereign what the real interpretation is. It is simply a pragmatic thing for the state, for the sovereign. Right? Whatever the sovereign needs to do in order to guarantee peace, that's what matters. So now, again, in order to clarify, another major confusion that often comes is that people believe that when we're talking about the sovereign and this artificial person, right? He talks about the metaphor of the person, that the sovereign has a face. People often are led to believe that he's talking about a king or a monarch. That is not his argument. That is not his argument. The sovereign is an office. It is an office that can be occupied by anybody. Okay, it can be occupied by a person, but it can also be occupied, as he says, by an assembly. So let's read now from chapter 19, the first passage. So he says that there are different ways in which commonwealths can be organized. The difference of commonwealths consists in the difference of the sovereign or the person representative of all and every one of the multitude. And because the sovereignty is either in one man or in an assembly of more than one. And into that assembly, either every man has the right to enter or not everyone, but certain men distinguished from the rest. It is manifest that there can be but three kinds of commonwealth. So there can be three ways in which the office of the sovereign itself can be organized. For the representative must needs be one man or more, and if more, then it is an assembly of all or but a part. But the representative is one man. When the representative is one man, then the commonwealth is a monarchy. Right? So if the sovereign office is occupied by only one person, then it's a monarchy. Then it's a king who has absolute power. Right? But when it is an assembly of men where all that will come together, all that will, that means the whole multitude that enters into the social covenant have access to enter that assembly, then it's a democracy, right? Or popular commonwealth. When an assembly of part only, then it is called an aristocracy. If there are only a few people amongst the entire social body, the body politic, then it is an aristocracy. So the office of the sovereign can be organized in different ways. But the point is that the office of the sovereign itself has a unified will, and it will act and do whatever is necessary, and it has unlimited and unchecked power in order to do what is necessary to protect and preserve life of its subjects. So nothing but absolute power is sufficient to guarantee peace. Now, the radical implication of him showing that there are different ways in which the office of the sovereign is can be organized is that underlying each type of government, the reality is that there is a certain kind of socially generated consent, right, mediated through the social covenant. So when it really comes to the nature of sovereignty, the nature of the relationship between the sovereign, the office of the sovereign and the subjects, there's no essential difference between democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy, right? So it doesn't matter if there is an assembly, there is a parliament or a senate, a parliament where anybody can vote and can elect and can stand for elections and can enter, or a senate where only some people have access to, or just one monarch. The relationship between the sovereignty, that is this kind of instituted entity, artificial entity that has coercive and common power over everybody else who are subject to it, and who do this in order to escape the state of nature. The relationship between the two is the same, despite of the form, despite it being a monarchy, an aristocracy, or democracy. This is kind of the profound truth of this social covenant for the institution of a commonwealth. Now, I think we can move towards a kind of conclusion, although it'll be, there are still a few details that perhaps we can elaborate on. But just to drive home the point, now I'm reading from chapter 30. This is the office of the sovereign. Again, office of the sovereign representative. We have clarified that by sovereign, he doesn't mean a king or a monarch. What he means, or even a queen, what he means is really the state itself, the state, right? So he says the office of the sovereign consists in the end for which he was trusted with the sovereign power, namely the procuration of the safety of the people, to which he is obliged by law of nature to render an account thereof to God, the author of the law, and to none but him. So if there's anything that the sovereign is responsible to, is God. But again, God is incomprehensible. So for all practical purposes, this obligation is irrelevant to us, right? Irrelevant to mortal humans who inhabit and live a worldly existence. And this intended should be done not by care applied to individuals further than their protection from injuries when they shall complain, but by a general providence contained in the public instruction of both doctrine and example, and in making and executing good laws. So ultimately, the argument is that the sovereign is the one who makes the laws of that particular commonwealth, of that state. And those laws must be good in that they actually, the end of them, their objective is life preservation. But he also says, secondly, it is against his duty, against the duty of the office of the sovereign, to let the people be ignorant or misinformed for the grounds and reasons of these essential rights. Now, why might this be important? It's because it is about educating the body politic. It is about educating the people who have come together and entered into social covenant about why the laws are needed. It is to impress upon them the fact that these laws are what enable the sovereign to protect them, right? So what it requires from the subjects is actually complete obedience to the laws and the office of the sovereign. Now, this raises the question, I think, how do we assess what is a good law or what is a just law? And the argument is simple. Any law that is made by the sovereign is a just law. So justice is something that is established by the sovereign itself, right? Again, now reading from chapter 30, he says, therefore, a law that is not needful, having not been the true end of law, is not good. A law may be conceived to be good when it is for the benefit of the sovereign, though it be not necessary for the people. But it is not so. For the good of the sovereign and the people cannot be separated. Now, the implication, again, the reason why any kind of law made by the sovereign can be considered just is precisely because it is in the structure of the argument that if you're entering into a conditional agreement for mutual protection and obedience, then the laws that the sovereign is making are for the good of the people. If they are not good for the people, then the contract, the social covenant is in some sense void again. Why? Because the very grounds on which they accept the terms, the body politic accepts the terms of coming into agreement with each other, is preservation of life. So if the laws are contrary to the preservation of life, then the whole body politic is in some sense diseased, is sick, and it will internally collapse. So although you have no real right to disobey, let's read from a different section, page 270. This is from chapter 21, says, to resist the commonwealth in defense of another man, guilty or innocent, no man hath liberty, because such liberty takes away from the sovereign the means of protecting us. So anybody who takes up arms in order to go against the sword of the sovereign, the sword of the commonwealth, nobody has right to do that, because that would mean you're contesting again sovereign power, absolute sovereign power. So you cannot disobey or contest or challenge sovereign power. In some sense, he even says towards the end that what is required is a certain kind of worshiping. Remember the phrase that we must be in awe of the sovereign, that we must worship like a civil religion. Just think about this in your present day context, the way in which people talk about their belonging, sense of belonging, and their obligations to a nation state, right? We are all Americans, right? We respect the American state, right? So although we don't have any right to disobey and to contest sovereign power, it raises the question about the problem of tyranny. Well, what happens when the government becomes tyrannical? Again, this goes back to the issue of just law. If the laws are there, of the actions of the sovereign, are such that your lives are under threat. Okay, that is the only test that you have. The only question you're gonna be forced to us from Hobbes' perspective is, well, are you protected? Are you protected or not? Is your life under threat or not? If your life is protected, then regardless of how much unfreedom you experience, how much tyranny you experience, anarchy is much worse. So the state of nature is much worse. So you might as well accept the rule of the sovereign. But if your life, if there is a clear and present danger to your life, then the social covenant is void, it is annulled, and you have the right to resist. Right? So to submit to a sovereign who's undermining your right to self-preservation, again, by reason, which is a natural endowment, is cannot hold true, right? So it is against reason to relinquish to sovereign authority that is threatening your life. So no rational person will not defend themselves if the state becomes violent towards your self-preservation, right? It violates your right to self-preservation. Now, the other side of the coin, however, is that you also don't really have a right to be protected. Again, your rights, your freedoms are that which the sovereign gives you. The sovereign is the ultimate author of your own rights. But as we've seen again, it is reasonable to expect, of citizens, from citizens, that they will be protected. Why? Because after all, the strength of sovereignty depends on the vigor of the people, as he puts it, right? So the power of the sovereign itself depends on the unity of the people. This has another implication, and it's an argument that we don't really have time to go into. But the argument is the Commonwealth or the state actually is in a relationship, is in some sense a state, is itself in a state of nature with respect to other states. So the United States, Mexico, Canada, Russia, Ukraine, England, name any other country, all right? All of them are in some sense in a state of nature with each other, right? Because there is no international body with the coercive power over all of them, right? If you're able to have such a power, then maybe all the states can enter into contract with each other. But nonetheless, in principle, it is possible to conceive that any country can declare war against any country. Just look at, again, what's happening between Russia and Ukraine. So there is the sovereign always faces a possibility, in principle, of invasion from another state. So the sovereign itself is the artificial man. There are many artificial sovereigns in this world, right? There are many nation states. All of them are in a state of nature with each other. So they all, in principle, face the threat of invasion and violence from another state. So if the state has to defend itself, if the sovereign has to defend itself, then it must make sure that there is no internal discord, there's no internal problems. So it is in the interest of the sovereign too, both for its own sustenance, that it will make laws that are good and just for the people. This again comes out of the logical consistency of his argument. So he's in order to eliminate internal weakness and rebellions at home, so that it can better resist invasions and competition from other states outside. That is why you would expect that the laws are just. So now, really working towards the conclusion, this is why the title of the book, it should now become clear, is the Leviathan. As he puts it in chapter 28, towards the end, he says, hitherto I have set forth the nature of man, together with the great power of his governor, that is the Commonwealth, whom I compared to Leviathan, taken from the comparison of the last two verses of 1 and 40th of Job, the book of Job, that is the 41st chapter of the book of Job, where God, having set forth the great power of Leviathan, called him the king of the proud. There is nothing, said he, on earth to be compared with him. He is made so as not to be afraid. He seeth every high thing below him, and is king of all children of the pride. But because he is immortal and subject to decay, as all other earthly creatures, and because there is that in heaven that he should stand in fear of, and whose laws he ought to obey, I shall, and he continues. So he's saying that on Earth, the only powerful creature is the Leviathan. There is nothing above him. The sovereign, that is the Leviathan, is the most powerful and absolute creature. And this comes out of the book of Job. So it's a beast. It's a beast. It's an artificial beast that has the power over, has dominion over all of men. I want to take the last couple of minutes to discuss the image of the book. This is, if you have this edition, you don't really get to see the whole image. I will put up in the video the actual image. But if you ponder upon it, you will notice many things that actually illustrate the argument with full force. Firstly, you can see that there is a vast multitude of people that actually come together in the form of the body of the sovereign itself, right? The sovereign has a face, right? The sovereign is a representative, but he's an artificial representative in that he's artificially constituted by this whole multitude coming together. And the multitude are all looking at the sovereign's face. They are in awe of the sovereign. And the sovereign's body is something that is bigger than the earth. It towers over the earth. And notice it, on the one hand, it wields the sword. There's no other body there that wields the sword. So the power, the force is unified in one hand. There's nobody challenging its authority. And on the other hand, it holds the crosier. The crosier as in the kind of religious staff of a religious figure, right? Typically the Pope. So the sovereign wields arms or military force on the one hand, and also the church. And it will do whatever is necessary in order to defend itself. But notice that the sovereign looks outside, right? It's not looking at the people, it is looking at outside because it is itself inhabiting a state of nature, inhabiting a state of nature with other commonwealths, with other sovereigns who might be willing to go into war with the sovereign, right? So this whole imagery of the sovereign is one of its artificiality created by people who have entered into a certain kind of social pact and social covenant that elevates them from a kind of multitude in the state of nature and establishes them as a body politic, that is, as a political community who have relinquished and transferred their rights and liberties that they have, their natural rights and liberties in order for self-preservation, to guarantee peace between themselves. And they do this again by instituting this sovereign power who has absolute power and to whom they are obedient, right? So I hope that this was illuminating and you got most of the bulk of the argument of Hobbes. We'll see now as we move on to Locke and Rousseau, who clearly are not fans of Hobbes in that they are afraid of precisely the kind of logic of the argument which leads to a defense of absolute sovereign power, and they want to contest that. But you will see that in some sense they are so endowed to Hobbes that they have to, in order to settle accounts with Hobbes, they have to sort of follow a similar kind of procedure of argumentation, right? So we'll see what that happens. We'll continue with Locke in the next session.